Shalom, my name is Joseph Shulam. I'm going to continue teaching from 1 Samuel, and we've gotten to chapter 18. Things are getting interesting. David killed Goliath, chapter 17. At first, King Saul is very happy about what David did. But when he heard the ladies of Jerusalem saying, "Ika Shaul ba'alafav and David berevotav," Saul hit thousands and David 10,000s. Saul, who was not the most self-secure, self-confident person, he suffered from lack of self-confidence from the very beginning of his kingship, from the time that he was crowned at Mitzpah, and he hid behind the luggage, behind the stuff, out of lack of confidence. People say shyness, but shyness can be also an indication of lack of confidence. And now, when he sees that David, little David, that he tried to dress him with his armor, with his helmet, with his shield, and David went without a helmet, without an armor, without a sword in his hand, just with a slingshot of a regular shepherd in the hills of Judea, and brought down that Philistine, and the women of Israel were singing praises to David. Saul did thousands and David 10,000. Saul got completely confused. He even lost track of who David is. That David that had been playing a musical instrument to calm Saul down. David that says that Saul loved him. David that was, admired by Jonathan, the son of King Saul, the heir of the throne of King Saul. Suddenly, Saul doesn't remember David, doesn't recognize David, and chapter 17, verse 57, the last verses. Then David returned from the slaughter of the Philistine. Abner took him and brought him before Saul with the head of the Philistine in his hand. And Saul said to him, "Whose son are you, young man?" He doesn't recognize him. And David, "I am the son of your servant Jesse the Bethlehemite." That's the end of chapter 17. And when he had finished speaking to Saul, the soul of Jonathan was knit with the soul of David. Jonathan was the one that was so impressed with David. He wanted to be David's friend. He wanted to be David's companion. He wanted David to be, his soul buddy. And he loved him as his own soul. That's verse 1 of chapter 18. Saul took him that day and would not let him go home to his father's house anymore. It's an interesting text. What happened? Did Saul lose confidence in David, or did he gain confidence in David? Did he start mistrusting David? After he had spent probably, I would say, the better part of a year or 2 years in Saul's presence, playing the music for Saul in his palace. And now that David was victorious over the Philistine, and no sword in David's hand, as the text says, Saul's confidence in David is shaken, and he wants David near him, next to him, so that he could observe him, control him. Bind him next to him in the palace, to where he cannot have access to the popularity that the people and the women of Israel were attributing to him. Then Jonathan and David made a covenant because he loved him as his own soul. And Jonathan took off the robe that was on him and gave it to David with his armor, even to his sword and his bow and his belt. In other words, Jonathan loves David so much he gives him all the princely paraphernalia. His bow, his belt, his sword, his armor. And he loves David. They become soul buddies. Verse 5, so David went out wherever Saul sent him and behaved wisely. And Saul set him over the men of war. And he was accepted in the sight of all the people and all the sight of Saul's servants. You know, David wins the heart of all those that are around King Saul. His servants, his generals, his army. He becomes a hero, a popular hero among everybody except Saul. Even the son of Saul, Jonathan, is on David's side. But Saul is a little bit paranoid from David. Now it happened in verse 6, as they were coming home, when David was returning from the slaughter of the Philistine, that a woman had come out of the city of Israel singing, dancing to meet King Saul, with tambourines, with joy, with musical instruments. So the women sang as they danced and said, Saul had slain his thousands and David his 10,000s. Then Saul was very, very angry. And the saying displeased him. And he said, they have described David 10,000, and to me they have ascribed only thousands. Now what more can he have but the kingdom? So Saul eyed David from that day forward. In other words, Saul lost confidence in David. Not because of David doing something wrong, but his own insecurities, his own fears in his heart, his own inability to see somebody else successful without his direct agency. So from that day on, Saul eyed David. He looked at David suspiciously, suspected David. And it happened on the next day that the distressing spirit from God came upon Saul. The evil spirit from God, Ruach Ra'ah in Hebrew. They translated distressing because they can't understand that God would give somebody an evil spirit. Distressing is also not good, but is not as bad as saying evil spirit came upon Saul, and he prophesied inside the house. So David played music with his hand at that as other times, but there was a spear in Saul's hand, and Saul cast the spear, for he said, I will pin David to the wall. But David escaped his prison twice. Now Saul was afraid of David. because the Lord was with him, but he had departed from Saul. Saul should have known that the Lord departed from him from chapter 15, when Samuel said that Lord will tear the kingdom from you and give it to somebody better than you. And so now King Saul, first king of Israel, from his head and shoulder above the people, good-looking, handsome young man, crowned 3 times, lost confidence in himself, in God, in Samuel for sure, and now he's afraid of David. He's jealous of David because of what the women are singing for David. And because he understood that the Lord was with David and no longer with him, that the Lord had departed from Saul. Therefore Saul removed him from his presence and made him his captain over 1,000. And he went out and came in before the people. This phrase, went out and came in before the people, is a military phrase. It's an idiom. It's an idiom that means that David was commanding the army. That David was doing the job of the king. That David was actually, Saul put him a captain of 1,000 to get him out of the palace, out of his presence. But actually, God blessed David by giving him this command job of an officer in the army of Israel, in the army of King Saul. He was successfully undertaking this new position and becoming popular with the people of Saul, with the army of Saul, because the Lord was with him. And although King Saul sees the success that David has among the military, he sees that success and he understands that David's popularity is growing greatly. There's not much he can do. But he's not stupid. Saul is not stupid. He can't, throw David out or kill him, because David's got the support of Jonathan, his Saul's son. He's got the support of Saul's family. Not only Jonathan, we'll find out soon that it's other members of Saul's family, his daughters. And he's got the support of the army, and he's got the support of the populace. So Saul's hands are tied, and his paranoia is growing. It's upsetting him. He's angry, displeased. That little musician playing the guitar or the violin or the harp to calm his spirit is taking over his royal popularity. Therefore, he removed him from his presence, sent him to the army to be in and out. We say in Hebrew, to be without and to feel within. And he thought that would resolve the problem, but it doesn't resolve the problem. It only aggravates the problem. It only aggravates the problem. And David is very wise. He's not doing anything against King Saul. He's behaving himself and giving Saul the honor. And he knows some things that we all need to know, that if I do right, God is with me. If I do wrong, even against somebody who may consider me his enemy, like King Saul, then I will be on my own. God is not going to be with me. And without God, no matter how smart, how good, how intelligent I am, I go do nothing. Nothing will work. And King Saul is still this, still bewildered with this evil spirit from God that God sends to him. And he can't get rid of it. And David is not next to him anymore because he threw the javelin twice trying to pin David to the wall. But he's sorry that he did it. And Saul, in verse 15, sees that David is behaving wisely, and he understands that David has got the popularity among the women, at least the women, but not only the women. And he doesn't know what to do. So what do you think he wants to do now in order to capture David and keep him close to him and yet under his control? He wants to give him his daughter in marriage, which is one of the reasons that David got the courage to go against Goliath. He knew that if he marries the princess, Saul's daughter, he will be in the palace not only as a musician, but as the son-in-law of Saul, of the king. He would be one of the princes. Very interesting idea Saul has. He thinks that by giving David his daughter, he will be able to control David. The people of Israel love David. The people of Judah love David. Jonathan loves David. And Saul says to David in verse 17, "Here is my older daughter Merav. I will give her to you as a wife. Only be valiant for me and fight the Lord's battle." For Saul thought, "Let my hand not be against him, but let the hand of the Philistine be against him." If I put David, marry him to my daughter and raise him in rank and send him to be the person who fights the Philistines, maybe the Philistines will kill him and my hands will be clean. He knows that he can't do it himself against David because David is so popular among the people. So verse 18 of chapter 18. So David said to Saul, "Who am I? And what is my life or my father's family in Israel that I should be the son-in-law of the king?" But it happened at that time when Merav, the older daughter of King Saul, should have been given to David, that she was given to Adriel the Meholatite as a wife. In other words, she probably was already in love with Adriel from Mecholah, place called Mecholah in the Jordan Valley, not south of the Sea of Galilee, south of Beit Shan, in the northern part of the Jordan Valley. And she's in love with given to marriage to Adriel the Meholite as a wife. Now Michal, Saul's daughter, loved David, the younger daughter of Saul. And they told Saul the thing pleased him. Oh, it's good. And Saul said, "I will give her to him, and she may be a snare to him, and that the hand of the Philistine may be against him." Therefore Saul said to David second time, "You shall be my son-in-law today." David doesn't mind that. He wanted that. That's what gave him the courage to go against Goliath. That he heard that King Saul will give him riches and his daughter as the wife. That's what motivated David to go against Goliath. He wanted to substantiate his coronation, his anointing with oil as the king of Israel by Samuel in the house of his father, in the house of Jesse in Bethlehem. Saul's idea, he will marry Michal, and Michal is a brat. According to this text, that's what I understand. And she will be a snare to him. She will drive him crazy. But she already loved David. I will give her to him that she may be a snare to him, and that the hand of the Philistine may be against him. You know, he sees two ways to get back to David. One is marry Michal, she's a brat. My younger daughter, she'll drive you crazy. Second thing is, you're going to be the chief of staff. You're going to be a soldier, an officer in my army, and I'm going to send you to fight the Philistines. But we already saw earlier that David fought the Philistines and killed 200 of them. And so David is not afraid of this. So Saul's servant spoke to his words in the hearing of David, and David says, does it seem to you a light thing to be the king's son-in-law, seeing I am a poor and lightly esteemed man? You know, I don't come from a noble family. I am from a poor family from Bethlehem, a shepherd boy from Bethlehem, from the house of Jesse. So it's not such a simple thing for me, a poor boy, a musician, a man of song and words, a poet, to be the son-in-law of the king. The servant of Saul told him, saying, in this manner David spoke. They went back to Saul and said, this is what David said. I feel very honored. It's not a simple thing, it's not a light thing for me to be the king's son-in-law. I'm, after all, a lightly esteemed man. Then Saul said, verse 25 of chapter 18, thus you shall say to David, the king does not desire any dowry, but 100 foreskins of the Philistines to take vengeance on the king's enemies. But Saul thought to make David fall by the hand of the Philistines. So when his servant told David these words, it pleased David well to become the king's son-in-law. Now the days had not expired. Therefore David arose and went, he and his men, and killed 200 men of the Philistines. And David brought their foreskins, and they gave him a full count to the king, and he might become the king's son-in-law. And Saul gave him Michal, his daughter, as a wife. Now that's an interesting text. When I read this text, I remember one of the Western movies. I forgot what the name of the movie is. Fighting with the Indians. Forgot who the actors are. Maybe John Wayne. Maybe somebody else. Jeff Chandler. Probably Jeff Chandler. Most people don't remember Jeff Chandler, but he was a great Jewish actor, fine actor, played many very important roles in the movies, main actor. Before Gary Cooper, before John Wayne, Jeff Chandler, in which they had to bring scalps in, the Indian scalps. The whites had to bring Indian scalps. Well, here you have King David and the army of Saul. Saul wanted 100 foreskins And David and his men brought to Saul 200 foreskins. In other words, they had killed and circumcised post-mortem 200 Philistines. And Saul now has no choice. He gives Michal, his daughter, as a wife to King David. Chapter 18, 1 Samuel, verse 28. Thus Saul saw and knew that the Lord was with David, that Michal, Saul's daughter, loved him, and Saul was still more afraid of David. And Saul was still more afraid of David. He thought that he would be, less afraid. But when David brings him the 200 foreskins, Saul is more afraid, not less afraid of King David. I'm in verse 28 of chapter 18. For David, that which Saul would be a trap. Saul thought it would be a trap to send David to kill 100 Philistines and bring the foreskin. For David, it was an opportunity. An opportunity to become the son-in-law of the king himself. And Michal, who was a brat, who was considered to be a snare, Saul's daughter, loved David. And Saul was still more afraid of David. So Saul became David's enemy continually. Then the princes of the Philistines went out to war. And so it was, whenever they went out, that David behaved more wisely than all the servants of Saul, so that his name became highly esteemed. The end of chapter 18. Everything that Saul did within the bounds of the palace, trying to control David, to subdue David, to get David killed, worked against him. That is the verse, if God is for us, who can be against us? That is the verse that